Hi, my name is Dodge Landesman, and as mentioned before, I've been going to New Hampshire a handful of times to really try to get these candidates running for president and to try to hear what they have to say in their own words. We oftentimes get these sound bites from the media that maybe show a 2 or 3 minute clip of their speech, but I always feel like it's a good idea to actually put their full words on so you can really judge the candidate for yourself and hear what they have to say. So I actually connected with Beto O'Rourke in Manchester, New Hampshire, at a local Mexican restaurant, which I thought was kind of interesting. It was a very tightly packed restaurant, but I think due to his experience in El Paso and his connection with the Mexican people, he felt it was kind of special to do it at a Mexican restaurant that was actually owned by an immigrant that was from Mexico, who was in New Hampshire. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And Beto gave a great speech. He didn't stand in any chair or anything like that or any table. So I think he's been paying attention to some of the media criticism and has listened to it. And he was very inspiring. You could see this magnetism. You could see his passion. You could see why so many people, even though he didn't get elected to the U.S. Senate, have glommed onto him. Because there's this charisma that really is Obama-like. People make that comparison, and I think it's a valid comparison. Because he really does have that Obama-like charisma where he could really inspire people, I think, in a very significant way. In his speech, one of the issues was he talked a lot about progressive issues, and he certainly seems mostly progressive on what's very important. So, for example, he's very pro-marijuana legalization. Actually, in Congress, he was one of the strongest congresspeople, one of the strongest representatives to advocate for full marijuana legalization. His counterpart in the Senate is Cory Booker, who's also been incredibly progressive and active on full-out 100% marijuana legalization. So if you're looking on that issue, Beto O'Rourke is great. He has that credibility, and I think that's his niche issue. As I mentioned before, different candidates have their niche issue, whether it be Warren with advocating for consumers, whether it be Cory Booker and his credibility on the criminal justice system, whether it be Andrew Yang and the universal basic income. All of them have the selling point, and all of them, most of these candidates, except for a handful, can use their experience to say, if you're really looking at this one issue, and this one issue is the most important to you, then I have that credibility in my past. And Beto has that for marijuana legalization and a whole host of other issues. Of course, he was very progressive in immigration, talked about his experience representing a border area, and again, has a lot of credibility there. Spoken Spanish, speaks fluent Spanish. I've been to Mexico a handful of times and speak some, so you kind of judge how well somebody can speak the language, and it's really perfect. And that's important. I think he'll get a lot of Latinos out to vote. They feel like, quite literally, hey, this guy speaks my language. You know, this guy understands me and my needs. And in that regard, I think, also because of his passion, he'd be a very effective general election candidate. But one of the issues is, when he was talking, is he sidestepped a bunch of other issues. Somebody asked him if he supported Medicare for all, and he talked about this sort of happy medium. You could have your cake and eat it too by supporting Medicare for America. And that's very different than Medicare for all, because it still includes some private insurance, and you have that option of choosing private insurance. Now, as somebody more moderate, to me that seems like the smart incremental approach. But there are a lot of people who say, well, that won't really work, and you need it to be fully public instead of privatized in order for Americans to get the health care that they need. So I'm not as much of an expert as I'd like to be, and healthcare is one of those intricate issues where you really have to be well informed. But personally, I like what he's saying. If you're ultra progressive, I think there are other more candidates, and healthcare is certainly an important facet of the 2020 presidential sweepstakes, who are more progressive and who fully support 100% Medicare for all. Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, obviously, Marianne Williamson, Andrew Yang, everybody in the more progressive class, except for Elizabeth Warren, who's kind of said different things about it. So that's been interesting as well to analyze. So we talked about his speech, and yeah, he really does have that passion and that charisma. And he did seem very poised and well-informed, even though he sidestepped some issues. He seemed great in criminal justice. But one of the issues is, I think him in general and these mistakes that he's made. And part of me wonders, is he necessarily ready for prime time? in his announcement video, having his wife sit by his side but literally not say a thing, to me, reeks of unintentional sexism. I don't think it was intentional. I think Beto has been a good father, and I think he is impressed with his wife because she's had an impressive career as well. But when you're running for president of the United States, you really have to be careful because all eyes are on you. And people from the feminist community, and that's an important issue, obviously, took very serious issue in that they felt like his wife was being silenced and was being sidelined. Again, that wasn't the intention, but you need to have clear eyes and more open ears if you want to represent the Democratic Party. This is the Democratic Party of 2019, not necessarily of even 2008 anymore. So a lot of these issues, people, I think, will focus on them a lot more intently. One of the other issues is, and I think this highlights some of the sexism in the media coverage, is that Beto took this very long road trip in between losing the Senate race and running for president. And for some reason, he didn't get any criticism. And I wonder if Kamala Harris had did that, if she was in a similar situation, or Elizabeth Warren or Tulsi Gabbard, would they have been criticized for not being good parents and not taking care of their kids? And, I don't know if it's a valid criticism or not. If it is, then it has to apply to men and women, obviously. And I don't know, part of me thinks it is a valid criticism because you just ran a hardcore campaign for U.S. Senate, and then immediately you take off on a road trip. And I'm thinking, man, wouldn't you want to see your kids? Isn't that the most important thing? And it seems like this crazy judgment call. I mean, if I ever became a parent and I had spent all this, campaigns are intense. They're 12-hour days at least. These intense 12-hour days on the trail, I never get to see my kids. You think the moment I'm back, I would just, especially if I were thinking about running for president, which is another huge time commitment, you would think, okay, I have this 3 to 4 month window. I really want to see my kids every single day and as much as possible. And Beto didn't do that. And I'm a huge advocate of road trips. That's what I've done a lot in my life. I've been to 200 cities, all via Greyhound bus in Mexico and Canada and the USA, but I don't have kids. And what all of this is it plays into Beto's immaturity factor, which I think is a very legitimate issue to focus on. Is he too much of a kid in some regard? With the road trips, with the constant cursing, I will say in New Hampshire, he did not curse. And, I curse once in a while, certainly, but Beto's potty mouth is constant. And it's unique amongst candidates. And you want to appear presidential, especially running against Trump, who's the opposite of presidential. You want to be the opposite of him in every regard. And I don't know at this moment if Beto is really that presidential, leaving his kids behind, with the cursing, with getting himself filmed while he had a root canal. I thought that was really gross and narcissistic. That's awesome that he talked to the dentist aide who was an immigrant herself and had that experience. But can't you just film her after you get your root canal instead of having people look at you get your teeth filled, which I just think is really gross. So this very narcissistic millennial, it's all about me feeling pervades Beto. And he needs to grow up. I think in a campaign you can grow up. You could certainly grow up in a year. And I have a lot of faith for him. He's certainly not my first choice or in my top 5. He could certainly get there, but he needs to be more conscientious of the world around him. And yeah, he needs to grow up. So I hope you enjoy the speech. And thanks for watching.
A country that has never been more divided, or more polarized, or more partisan than it is at this moment. Not to descend into that ugliness, and that meanness, and that pettiness, and that name calling. Not to define ourselves by our fears and our paranoias and our anxieties. Not to pit one another against one another. But to be known by our ambition, our aspirations, our common goals, the common cause, and the common ground upon which we stand. Before you're a Republican or a Democrat, from a big city or a small town, you are an American and my fellow human being. And we're going to treat one another who are joined, not separated by the Rio Grande River in our international boundary line, forming something far greater than the sum of the people or the parts involved. Beautiful, magical. Ciudad Juarez is the first place I took Amy, my wife now, on our first date, a blind date. Going to the Kentucky Club on the Juarez, where they purport to have invented the margarita. Having a couple of those walking past the customs house where the first time that a president of the United States and the president of Mexico ever met, they met there in 1909, and neither Taft nor Diaz needed a translator because each spoke both English and Spanish. Taking Amy past that to the Mission of Guadalupe, which has stood the test of time in 350 years and took in the sights and the sounds and the smells of this community that I love so much and that she grew to love because she was not from there. And in that community of El Paso, we are now raising Ulysses, who's 12, Molly, who's 10, Henry, who is 8 years old, and it happens to be, not coincidentally, one of the safest cities in the United States of America. Safe, not in spite of the fact that we are a city of immigrants. And a quarter of those with whom we live were born somewhere else, chose us, brought their genius to this country, along with the opportunity that their very presence provides. Their presence in this country, here in Manchester, in my hometown of El Paso, makes us stronger, makes us more successful, and yes, makes us more secure. When we treat one another with dignity and respect, that's how we secure our communities. No necesitamos un muro. Cuando tratamos gente con respeto y dignidad, vamos a asegurar nuestras comunidades. That's the way that we can show this profoundly positive story of El Paso, of Manchester, of America, a country comprised of immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees from the world over. We lose sight of that at our peril. We lose sight of that when we start to do things like take kids from their parents after they've traveled 2,000 miles, much of that on foot, some of that atop a train known as the Beast or La Bestia, at their most desperate and vulnerable moment, taking the very child for whom they risked their lives, deporting that parent back to the country from which she fled, keeping them separated with no hope or prospect of reunification until we make that this country's priority. When our laws and our practices and our policies match our values, the reality on the ground, the experiences of our lives, we will be a better country. Not only will we reunite all those kids and stop separating them from their folks, but we will also free dreamers from any fear of deportation by making them U.S. citizens. Now, whether it's immigration or healthcare, in this, the wealthiest country on the planet, which for whatever reason has not found the resources or the will to take care of millions of Americans who cannot see a doctor, who even when they are insured cannot afford their prescriptions, who cannot take their child to a therapist so that she is well enough to learn the next day. Parents of medically fragile and complex children who live in constant fear that their insurance will not cover the next piece of equipment or procedure. We, the people of America, not Democrats, not Republicans, all of us need to make sure that we have guaranteed high quality, universal health care for every single American. We need to make sure that we have an economy that works for all. Right now, we have an economy that works really well for a few and not well enough for far too many. Imagine having the discretionary income to spend $3 or $4 million gaming the college admissions process to get your kid into school, and then acknowledge that there are so many families that don't have $300 or $400 to make the down payment on tuition on a university or a community college or a trade school. Here, we need to make sure that this economy works for everyone, because if our democracy is going to survive, every single family, and especially every single child, must see a future, hope, and opportunity in this country, and we are closing that out for far too many right now. You cannot have political democracy without having something approaching economic democracy in this country, and the concentration of wealth and power and privilege is going to destroy this country and our democracy if we do not do something about it. Because if we want to face this healthcare challenge, if we want to fix our immigration system, if we want to make sure there are jobs that provide dignity and living wages for every single one of us, if we want to guarantee that no school teacher works a second or a third job just to make ends meet, if we want to make sure that in a country that loses 30,000 of our fellow Americans every year to gun violence, that we take the necessary steps of universal background checks and we stop selling weapons of war into our communities. If we want to address an opioid crisis that is of our own making, we are 4% of the globe's population. We consume 85% of our opioids, and that did not happen accidentally. There are corporations, Purdue Pharma first and foremost among them, who marketed these very addictive drugs to prescribers and doctors as some kind of miracle pill with no side effects. Almost everyone who is using heroin or fentanyl illegally is doing it after being legally prescribed an opioid. We need to make sure that that is not a criminal justice problem. It is a public health opportunity, treating people with compassion, caring for them, putting them on the long-term road to recovery, at the same time that we hold accountable those who perpetrated this disaster on our communities, and understand that right now in the United States of America, we have the largest prison population per capita on the planet, and it is disproportionately comprised of people of color. So many arrested for nonviolent drug crimes like possession of marijuana, a substance that is legal in most states in this country. How can those Purdue execs get off scot-free while we are locking people up disproportionately of color for possession of something that will kill nobody and is already legal in so many states? Folks who, when released from jail, will be forced to check a box on any employment application form saying they have a conviction, making it less likely that they get the job, who will not be eligible for student loans or grants or scholarships, will have no ability to improve themselves through higher education. All of these things are connected, and all of them are premised on this democracy, the single greatest mechanism ever devised by humankind to call forth the genius, the innovation, the ingenuity, the resolve of a people. And if we're going to meet these challenges, all of them, including the greatest existential one of them all, climate change, freeing ourselves from a dependence on fossil fuels, carbon energy, investing in renewable energy, and the jobs, the high wage, high skill, high value wind, solar, bioenergy jobs that are connected to a change in our economy and how this planet warms. If we're going to reassert our global leadership, we must fix this democracy, because right now it is captured, it is corrupted by corporations, by special interests, by that concentration of wealth and privilege. I want to thank you via your representative, Chris Pappas, who was a lead sponsor on H.R. 1 which seeks to end this corruption, the capture by special interests, to ensure that members of Congress no longer choose their constituents by ending political gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering, which we experience in Texas, getting big, unaccountable money out of our politics, ensuring that everyone who should be able to vote can. In addition to what he's done, we need a new Voting Rights Act in this country. Same-day voter registration, making sure that everyone is represented and reflected in our democracy. But beyond the laws that we pass and that I want to sign into law, I want to make sure that we walk the talk while we have the chance right now. That's why this campaign receives no contributions from lobbyists or political action committees or corporations. It's all people from every single state all the time. Not only is that the best way to campaign, perhaps the only way to win, it is going to be the only way that we are prepared to lead this country together, to heal the divisions that we find right now, and to bring us around the common cause, the common challenges, and the common goals, so that our kids and grandkids, the people of the future, look back on us, the people of 2019, with pride and with gratitude, and do not find themselves wondering, who were those pendejos who wasted the best chance that we had, because we are the last best hope of this planet, of this earth, and it's on us. And I know that we are going to be up to this moment, a match for the challenge. You with me? Yeah! Well, I am with you, looking forward to the conversation. My gratitude to Martine, to Consuelos, to every one of you who has welcomed us out today. Looking forward to hearing what's on your mind, doing my best to answer your questions, and having a conversation. If I could, I'd like to begin with the first question that was asked of me as I was introducing myself. When I talked about healthcare, the question was, well, how are you going to do it? There are two extraordinary members of Congress, Jan Schakowsky from Illinois, Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut, who have introduced a proposal called Medicare for America. What this does is it ensures that we get to that goal of guaranteed, high quality health care for every single American as quickly as possible. If you have employer-based and funded insurance and you like it, you like your doctors, you like the network that you're in, keep it. If you do not like your doctors or your network or your insurance, you can enroll in Medicare. If you have no insurance or coverage at all, you enroll in Medicare. We make Medicare the program of choice by investing in it, strengthening it, so that people elect to move over time, and that becomes the system in our country. Now, there are different ways to get here, and I heard some folks shout out different policies. That's fine. But let's find a way to not allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good. Human lives depend on it right now in a country that loses our fellow Americans to diabetes, to the flu, to curable cancers for as long as we wait to get to a solution. So thank you for asking the question earlier. Yes, sir.
You're going to get elected based on how you feel about domestic issues. And if you're fortunate enough to become president, you're going to be spending more than half your time dealing with international issues. So my question is, what qualifies for you to be the leader of the free world?
Thank you for the question. This is a golden opportunity for this country to reassert its leadership in the world. Leadership that was purchased on the sacrifice and on the lives of tens of thousands of Americans, whether they stormed the beaches in Normandy, whether they served in Vietnam, whether their lives are on the line right now tonight, where it is tonight in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. We cannot be the generation that squandered that leadership. We cannot turn our backs on our allies as our current president has done, questioning the wisdom of NATO, whose 5th article has only been invoked once, the common defense, when this country was attacked in 9/11, and then we subsequently invaded Afghanistan with every single one of our allies at our back. I want to make sure that we have a foreign policy that is oriented towards our real priorities. This hemisphere, the people to whom we are literally connected by land, it should not have surprised us that tens of thousands of families migrated 2,000 miles to seek shelter and refuge and asylum in this country. The drug wars that we have fought, our interventions in their civil wars in Nicaragua and El Salvador, the instability we provoked in Guatemala and Honduras, we are reaping the consequences of those foreign policy decisions right now. I want to make sure that we end the wars that we are in, 18 years and counting in Afghanistan, 27, almost 28 years and counting in Iraq. Trillions of dollars of spent, thousands of lives lost, tens of thousands of lives taken in our name. As we do that, I want to make sure that we care for every single woman and man who has borne that battle in a country that loses 20 veterans a day, every single day, by their own hands. 16 of those 20 unable or for whatever reason unwilling to get into a VA and see that provider who can save their lives. Lastly, I want to make sure that we resolve otherwise intractable problems as peacefully as possible. Our preceding president, faced with the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran, without firing a shot, without invading yet another Middle East country, stopped that country from its pursuit of nuclear weapons, did not solve every problem related to it. We're still working on it. Perhaps that could serve as a model for nonviolent, non-military resolution of our crises abroad. And lastly, and most important, I mentioned the challenge of climate change. If you're my age, 46 years old or older, you might be fine. If you're younger, if you're the child, like my kids, of someone my age, the grandchildren, the generations to come, the problems that we have right now, the unprecedented wildfires raging across California, the floods that we see in the Midwest, the 58 inches of rain dropped on Houston, Texas, which is the landfall record for as long as we've been keeping them, and it was set in 2017, the third 500-year flood in just the last 5 years, the droughts that undermine our farmers' ability to grow our own food and fiber. The problems that we have today, the 400,000 apprehensions on the southern border, will be nothing compared to what our kids will face when there are some countries on this planet that will no longer support human life, when we can no longer grow what we need in the places that we're planting today, when natural disasters prevent people from living anywhere near the ocean, whether it's here in New Hampshire or my home state of Texas. We still have time to act. But even if the United States did everything we possibly could, it would not be enough. We need to bring the rest of the world with us. So reasserting our role on the global stage, building respect for the United States after so much of it has been squandered in this administration, has to be our priority in the next. Thank you for asking the question. We were on to something in this 9-month door-knocking effort when, with a month to go in the election, I walked in to a restaurant like this one. It was a Monday morning, and this guy stopped me. He says, "Are you Beto O'Rourke?" And I said, "I am." And he said, "Well, last week, Thursday, you knocked on my grandmother's door, and she invited you in. She told you about her grandson, who's a Marine, her daughter, who's a school teacher. You listened, you took it in, and then you knocked on her neighbor's door and the next neighbor's door. Well, I and my 32 cousins went to her house that Sunday for menudo, and she made each of us promise that we would vote for you." Now, the guy had never heard of me before. He was going to vote for me, and he said, "Whatever you do, do not mess this up, because you've got our entire family with you." When we ran for Senate in Texas, giving up what is called a safe seat, although I take nothing or no one for granted, to run in a state that was so reliably red, that had not elected a Democrat to the Senate since 1988. Everybody thought this was a pipe dream. It wasn't worth doing. When you add to that we took not a dime from a political action committee, they thought there was no way we were going to finance it. What we did is show up in every single one of the 254 counties of Texas, no matter how red or how blue, no me importa, no matter how big or how small, we showed up. King County voted for Trump 96% in the last election. We showed up in Guthrie, the county seat. Listen to those, because everyone, you would agree with me, is deserving of our respect, of being heard, of being fought for, of being served, regardless of where they live or who they voted for or who they vote for next time. We didn't win the race. We lost by 2.6%, but I'll tell you what, we got to be part of something absolutely extraordinary. Our state, 50th in the nation in voter turnout before this election, on purpose, by design. Some people, because of their race, ethnicity, drawn out of their congressional districts. We transcended some of those barriers. We saw young voter turnout up 500% from the last election, because we did not treat young people as the leaders of tomorrow. We treated young people as the leaders of today, because that's what they are on any issue that matters. And though we did not win, we saw 2 safe Republican seats now held by Democrats, and in Houston, Texas, Harris County, 17 African American women won judicial positions, literally changing the face of criminal justice in our largest city in Texas and in our most diverse city. So the question is, what are the lessons that you take from that? Take no one for granted, write nobody off, show up for everyone, everywhere. Demonstrate profound respect for those whom you hope to serve. Learn from them by listening to them. Take the examples that you find and apply them to your campaign and to the challenges that face this country. That's the way we're running this one. You will not hear me demean another person, another candidate for office, because come summer 2020, all of us are going to be on the same page, getting behind the candidate, regardless of who she or he is. We want them to be as successful as possible, not only in defeating President Trump, but on day one of 2021, leading this great country towards greatness. Thank you. Thanks for
I'm an only parent now to 3 beautiful kids, and we're behind on our mortgage by $60,000. So our house is going to be auctioned off in the next 2 months, and we have nowhere to go. There's no housing. And they said housing applications take 3 to 10 years in Massachusetts, of all states. Oh, what can we do about affordable housing?
The question is about affordable housing, and you're courageous in sharing your personal story, the debt that you're in, and some of the obstacles that you confront. So 2 things. 1, how do we make sure that those who want to build wealth, have a home, an investment that not only can they enjoy, but they can pass on to their kids. How do we do that? And then for those who own a home but are under crushing debt, how do we help them to refinance their mortgages or afford to stay in their communities? And then how do we meet the challenge of some communities growing faster than government is able to keep pace to ensure that you can afford to stay in your home? Texas, like New Hampshire, does not have a state income tax. We ask a lot of our property taxpayers, and in some cases we tax people out of their homes when the state and the federal government shed their burden and their share of the cost of public education, city government, infrastructure, or our needs. I want to make sure that Housing and Urban Development makes an investment in every single community, understands that the dignity of our fellow Americans is premised not only on healthcare, not only on having a job that pays a living wage, but having a roof over your head and the ability to build equity. I want to make sure that especially in communities that have been hit hard, or communities of color that have really, relative to white communities, never had a chance to advance from redlining and racist lending practices, that we address and correct some of those ills. Now, doing this is not going to be inexpensive, but I feel that the investment in these communities strengthens them, deepens the property tax base, allows more of us to shoulder our fair share of the burden, so it rests a little bit lighter on everyone else. I'll make sure that we select a Secretary of HUD who makes this a priority, a Secretary of HUD who has and believes in and enforces through a civil rights division, which is being undermined right now in the Trump administration. And I'll make sure, because this is all connected, that everyone can count on a wage that pays enough to live that life of dignity, to meet your mortgage payments. The sooner we get to $15 an hour as the floor for wages paid in this country, the sooner more people are going to be able to afford their mortgages.
I went to college. I have 2 degrees, and I still can't afford my mortgage.
Thank you for,
What do you have explained to DACA? What is your plan?
yes. So, gracias para la pregunta. Quiero que quiere que responde en inglés o español. Okay.
It's English, it's okay.
So, deferred action for childhood arrivals. This is the more than 1 million of our fellow Americans whom we call dreamers, every bit as American as anyone else, except for their immigration status. A document that can prove that they can stay here without legal problems, without the fear of deportation. Not only as president would I ensure that DACA implemented by President Obama is not undermined, but I would get past the executive order and make sure that we have legislation that I could sign into law that would permanently free those dreamers from any fear of deportation by making them U.S. citizens. The benefit accrues not just to those dreamers, but to all of us who will be the beneficiaries of what they do, what they create. We got to remind ourselves those dreamers are not just the students in the classroom. They are very often the teachers teaching the students in the classroom. They're not just being protected by service members who are deployed around the world. They are very often deployed around the world as well. They are our fellow Americans. Let's make them U.S. citizens and gain the maximum benefit of what they can contribute to this great country.
Yes. I work in education, and the past 2 years I worked in some of the public elementary schools here in Manchester, some of which lack a lot of resources, very much are environments where there is more police presence than guidance counselors, and where the students are just not given what they're needed. So I'm wondering what we're going to do to address the school to prison pipeline, and also to ensure that our public schools are not places where students are set up to fail.
Yeah, great question. First of all, I want to make sure that we include some of the successes that we're seeing. My 3 kids in El Paso go to world-class public schools, same public school that I went to, Mesita Elementary, only now, unlike in my time there, it's a true dual language program. And here we are in the largest binational community. They're learning math in Spanish, they're learning math in English. They're learning and thinking, existing in both languages and in both cultures, and it's powerful. And I'm really, really proud of that. And that came up that was devised not by somebody in elected office. That came from school teachers, educators, folks in the community who showed true leadership. And we see that all over the country. Why? Why in this country Are we asking school teachers and educators and cafeteria workers and nurses and librarians and therapists to work a second or a third job to finance their calling of being in front of those kids, the most important job, unlocking their lifelong love of learning so that they can reach their potential? Why do we ask teachers who in Texas on average take $800 out of their own pocket, not just to decorate the classroom or buy supplies for the kid who has none, but also to pay for a warm meal for that child on free and reduced breakfast and lunch who does not have a dinner at home waiting for her, or a new set of clothes for the kid who's shown up in the same set of clothes every single day? I just want her, I want him to have that one job, focusing on those children. When you add to that the threat of violence in those schools, asking that teacher to stand between those students for whom she's already sacrificed so much, and an active shooter for which we prepare in our schools back in El Paso, maybe in your schools here, this is absolutely unconscionable. So let's do this. Let's invest in those public school educators so they just have that one job and can afford to keep it. Let's also free them from some of these high stakes, high pressure, standardized tests that remove days and hours of instruction and away from being able to use their creativity and answer their calling for every kid, because they're spending so much time on standardized test prep. Let's make sure that, to your question about a school to prison pipeline, as a white man, didn't experience it, didn't fully understand it, and I'm still learning. But what I learned in part is that this doesn't begin in high school, where I may have imagined that it did. At 5 years old, in the kindergarten classroom, an African American child stands a 4 to 5 times a better chance of being suspended or expelled for the same infraction as a white child. Right. We are diminishing expectations and setting up kids to fail. Kids who on the first day of kindergarten are already 8 months back in reading comprehension, 10 months back in math. So a couple of things to address this. One, let's move the starting line back universally for every child to 4 years old and pre-K. It's an investment, but well worth making and will produce a return. Let's recruit and retain teachers who look like the students in their classroom. We're gonna have better outcomes and results if we do that. And then lastly, let's make cost no barrier to advancement after high school. Now, whether that is an apprenticeship with the union, going to a trade school or community college, or a public 4-year university, you should not take on a dime of debt. And again, I know that this is something that New Hampshire understands best because you have the highest rate of student loan indebtedness in the country. And if you want to be a school teacher, if you're willing to provide this kind of public service, let's think about refinancing or wiping clean your student loan debt so you can focus on those kids. So thank you for the question.
Taken to employ those, reach out and employ those with disabilities on your campaign? And what efforts would you take if you were given the chance to have an administration? And then also, what efforts are you guys taking to make sure that your stops on the campaign are in accessible venues like Consuelos?
Okay, thank you. Really great question. 1 in 5 Americans living with a disability, how do we ensure that their potential, their genius is reflected in the campaign that we run and in an administration that I would lead? How do we make sure that we have campaign stops that are accessible to everyone who wants to come to them? The short answer to your question is I've got to do a lot better job of making sure that everyone can come forward and contribute. My sister in special education classes every single year of her education, now living in an assisted living community, now doing her best to find purpose and function and work. I've seen what that's done for her life to be able to meet some of those challenges. I know from a federal perspective, when it comes to IDEA funding in our public schools, the mandate is 40%. Right now, the federal government is spending 17%. Those special education teachers, those teachers who work with children with disabilities, are asking to do more without having the resources or the support or the additional staffing to meet that challenge. I want to make sure, and this is an open call, that everyone from every part of the country, from every set of experiences and background, can join this campaign. and can be in positions of leadership in this campaign. And so through you and others who are watching this, I want to ensure that more Americans living with disabilities are part of the leadership of this campaign. I want to make sure that in our administration, in senior positions of trust and authority, there are people living with disabilities who are there. It's the best way to ensure that we have policies that match the needs and the opportunities that we have in our communities and in our country. Thank you for being here and for asking the question. Okay, we can do two more, and then I'll come to you. It's the full benefit of everyone who's called to this country, who wants to contribute their talent and their genius to our shared success. Then we need to think about how we ask people to come to this country in the first place. Sometimes we say, why don't you just get in the back of the line and do it the way my parents or grandparents or ancestors did it? We may not know when we say that the line stretches back 20 years or more in some cases. We may also not understand that some people are literally fleeing for their lives when they come to this country. And to reject them and return them to their country of origin is to send them to almost certain death and the deaths of their children. So in order to realize our own self-economic interest and to answer the moral imperative to which each of us ultimately responds, our immigration laws need to be rewritten in our own image to increase the visa caps so that more people can join their families, work jobs, contribute to our economic success. We need to make sure, we mentioned dreamers, but that cannot come at the price of the parents of dreamers, the original dreamers. It cannot come at the cost of a 2,000-mile wall or militarizing our border. We can rewrite our immigration laws in our own image, from our own values, to our mutual benefit and success. Gracias para la pregunta. Sí. This will be our last question. Thank you.
So the city of Manchester is the most diverse part of New Hampshire. So it's very important to me that a candidate and ultimately a president actually expresses concern for the treatment of people of color within the criminal justice system. So, and you did mention a little bit about how we are disproportionately affected by nonviolent drug-related offenses. So what I want to know is how you would go about creating a system that works for not just people that look like you, but people that look like me, as well as would you support expunging the records of those who are already convicted of nonviolent drug-related offenses?
Really good questions around criminal justice and equal treatment and some expectation of equal opportunity in this country. I mentioned earlier when I was talking about criminal justice, largest prison population per capita on the planet, disproportionately comprised of people of color, and beyond the time that they're locked up and that we're locking up their potential, we're constraining them to narrowed options and choices and outcomes over the course of their life. No longer qualifying for a student loan, very often unable to get a job after they've been forced to check a box on an employment application form. The question was asked, in addition to my position to end the federal prohibition on marijuana, to make sure that every veteran who returns from every conflict, who does not want to be prescribed an opioid, and whose doctor believes that medicinal cannabis is a better course of treatment, is able to do that, to make sure that we are not putting people disproportionately of color behind bars for possessing something that is legal in so many parts of the country. We must also expunge, that means wipe clean, the arrest records of those arrested for possession of that substance for a non-violent drug crime. But we've got to go further, because it's the criminal justice system, it's that schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline, it's a maternal mortality rate in this country that is staggering and 2 to 3 times as deadly for women of color. It's the fact that in this country there is 10 times the wealth in white America than there is in black America. It's the fact that we have not squarely faced the consequences and the truth of slavery, segregation, of suppression that is still going on in our communities throughout this country. So all of this is connected in my mind, and I want to make sure our campaign reflects that, our administration reflects that, and then we work as hard as we can to bring forth the genius and the potential of every single one of us, regardless of the differences. Thank you for asking the question. Appreciate it. Thank you very